Most people assume that if the United States and Iran ever fight a full-scale war, the result would be obvious. The United States is the most powerful military force in the world. It has advanced fighter jets, powerful missiles, global alliances, and military bases across the planet. On paper, it looks like a completely uneven fight, but history tells us something very surprising. Many times in the past, powerful empires with stronger armies and bigger economies have struggled or even lost against much smaller opponents. Again and again, the side that looked weaker at the beginning ended up causing serious trouble for the stronger empire. So the real question isn't just about weapons, money, or military technology. The real question is how power actually works in long conflicts. In this video, we're going to look at a very important idea that helps explain this pattern. It's known as the law of asymmetry. This concept helps us understand why stronger powers don't always win wars as easily as people expect. And once you understand this idea, the possible outcome of a conflict between the United States and Iran starts to look very different. To see why, we first need to understand how asymmetric conflicts work and why history often favors the side that seems weaker at the beginning. To understand why powerful countries sometimes struggle in wars, we need to look at a simple but important idea called the law of asymmetry. At first, this idea sounds counterintuitive. When two countries fight, we usually expect the stronger one to win easily. The side with the bigger military, better technology, and more resources should dominate the battlefield. In the case of the United States and Iran, the difference in power looks very clear. The United States has a far larger economy, a more advanced military, and strong alliances around the world. So logically, many people assume that Iran would have little chance in a direct confrontation. But the law of asymmetry tells us something different. It says that when two sides are very unequal in power, the weaker side often develops advantages that the stronger side doesn't have. The stronger power fights using its massive system, large armies, complex strategies, and advanced technology. But the weaker side usually fights in a very different way. Instead of relying on size and resources, the weaker side focuses on adaptation, resilience, and strategy. They look for ways to exploit the weaknesses of the stronger power. And this is where the dynamic of asymmetric conflict begins. The stronger side expects a quick and decisive victory, but the weaker side isn't trying to win quickly. Instead, it focuses on surviving, adapting, and slowly exhausting the stronger opponent. This pattern has appeared many times throughout history. To really understand how this works, we need to look at examples from the past, because history is full of moments when powerful empires were challenged by much smaller forces. If this idea sounds surprising, history actually gives us many examples. Time after time, powerful empires have faced serious challenges from smaller forces that seemed much weaker at the start. Take the Persian Empire in ancient times. Around 490 BC, Persia was the most powerful empire in the world. It had enormous wealth, huge armies, and vast territory stretching across much of the known world. When Persia invaded Greece, most people would have expected a quick victory, but that's not what happened. The Greek city-states, especially Athens and Sparta, were much smaller and had far fewer resources. Yet they managed to defeat the Persians, not just once, but twice. Another famous example came later when Alexander the Great and his Macedonian army attacked Persia. Macedonia was not a massive empire at the time. It was a relatively small kingdom compared to the enormous Persian Empire. Yet within about 10 years, Alexander managed to conquer almost the entire Persian Empire. And these kinds of stories appear throughout history. Small groups from the borders of empires, tribes, smaller nations, or rising powers have often managed to challenge or even defeat massive empires. So this raises an important question. If empires are supposed to be so powerful, with huge populations, advanced organization, and enormous resources, why do they keep losing to smaller opponents? To answer that, we need to understand what actually makes an empire powerful in the first place, and why those same strengths can slowly turn into weaknesses over time. To understand why empires eventually struggle, we first need to look at what makes them powerful in the first place. According to this idea, there are three major advantages that every empire has. The first advantage is mass. Empires usually control very large populations. They have millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of people. This gives them a huge pool of soldiers, workers, and resources. In the case of the United States, the population is already massive. But the real advantage goes even further. The United States also has allies across the world, countries in Europe, East Asia, and other regions. With military bases and partnerships around the globe, it can draw support from a much larger network of people and resources. The second advantage is organization. Empires develop strong systems to manage their population and resources. They build complex governments, institutions, and military structures that allow them to coordinate large operations. This organization also supports scientific research and technological development. That's why powerful countries often develop the most advanced weapons. Satellites, precision missiles, stealth bombers, and advanced fighter jets are all products of this organized system. The third advantage is something we can call endurance. Because empires have so many resources, they can afford to absorb losses. If they lose soldiers or equipment in one battle, they have the wealth and capacity to rebuild and continue fighting. In theory, these three advantages, mass, organization, and endurance, should make an empire almost unstoppable. But history shows us something very different. Over time, the same strengths that make empires powerful can slowly begin to weaken them. At first glance, the advantages of an empire, mass, organization, and endurance, look like permanent strengths. But over time, these strengths can slowly turn into serious weaknesses. Let's start with mass, or having a very large population. When a society becomes very large, competition for resources also grows. Inequality often increases. Some groups become extremely wealthy, while others struggle with debt, rising costs, and limited opportunities. As this gap grows, people begin focusing more on personal survival and economic pressure rather than national unity. Many citizens may feel disconnected from the government or political system, and when that happens, their motivation to sacrifice for the country, especially in a distant war, can become weaker. The second issue comes from organization. Large empires rely on powerful institutions and elites to manage their systems. Over time, however, these elites can become more focused on protecting their own power and wealth. Instead of working for the broader society, different political and economic groups start competing against each other. This can create deep internal divisions. In modern terms, this often appears as political polarization, intense rivalries between political parties, and constant internal conflict. When a country becomes consumed by internal struggles, it can become distracted from external threats. The third issue comes from endurance, or the ability to survive losses. When a country becomes extremely powerful, it may start to believe that its dominance is permanent. This can create overconfidence. Leaders may assume that mistakes won't have serious consequences, and the same strategies can be repeated again and again. Over time, this kind of arrogance can lead to serious miscalculations, and when these weaknesses combine, even a powerful empire can become vulnerable. As these weaknesses grow, another problem often begins to appear inside large empires. It starts with the rise of powerful elites. In highly organized societies, certain groups gain control over political power, economic resources, and major institutions. At first, these elites help build the system and keep it running, but over time, their priorities can change. Instead of focusing on the long-term strength of the country, many elites begin competing with each other for more power, more influence, and more wealth. This competition can become intense. Historians sometimes call this problem elite overproduction. It means that more and more people from powerful families or political groups want positions of authority, but there are only so many positions available. As the number of ambitious elites grows, rivalry between them also increases. And when that happens, internal conflicts begin to dominate the political system. Different factions fight each other for control. Political divisions deepen. Cooperation becomes harder. Governments struggle to make clear decisions. We've seen this pattern in many historical empires before major crises or revolutions. Internal competition among powerful groups weakens the stability of the entire system. At the same time, ordinary people watching these conflicts often lose trust in their leaders. So instead of unity, the society becomes divided and distracted. And when an empire becomes deeply focused on its own internal struggles, it can lose the ability to clearly see threats coming from the outside. This is often the moment when a determined rival begins to take advantage of those weaknesses. While powerful empires slowly struggle with internal problems, their opponents often develop very different strengths. Remember, the weaker side usually doesn't have the same resources, technology, or global alliances. But in asymmetric conflicts, victory doesn't always depend on having the biggest military. Instead, it often depends on three key qualities. The first is energy. Smaller nations that feel threatened or cornered often develop very strong motivation. Their population may see the conflict as a fight for survival, identity, or national pride. This creates a level of determination that can be difficult for larger empires to match. The second quality is openness. Unlike large empires that can become rigid and bureaucratic, smaller states often adapt more quickly. They study their mistakes, learn from other countries, and experiment with new strategies. This flexibility allows them to adjust faster on the battlefield. The third quality is cohesion. If the society remains united, it can become much harder to defeat. When people share a strong sense of purpose and trust each other, they are more willing to endure hardship and continue fighting even when conditions are difficult. These three qualities, energy, openness, and cohesion, can sometimes offset the massive advantages of a stronger empire. And if a smaller power manages to combine all three, it can become surprisingly resilient in a long conflict, which leads us to the most important question in this entire discussion. So when people analyze a possible conflict between the United States and Iran, they often focus on the wrong things. They look at military budgets, advanced weapons, or the size of each country's economy. Those factors are important, but they don't always determine the final outcome of a long conflict. The more important question is much simpler. Can Iran transform itself into a society that is energetic, adaptable, and united? If people inside the country become highly motivated, if they learn quickly from their mistakes and improve their strategies, and if they remain united around a shared national purpose, then the balance of the conflict could look very different from what many people expect. On the other hand, large empires often struggle to change quickly. Their systems are complex, their institutions are slow, and their leaders may be reluctant to admit mistakes. This can make adaptation much harder. That's why the key issue in this conflict may not be technology or military strength. Instead, it may come down to something deeper, which society is able to adapt, stay motivated, and remain united under pressure. Because in many moments throughout history, the side that mastered those qualities ended up surprising the entire world.